The darkness of the room only made the cold light from the fluorescent ceiling lamps stand out more. The silence was so heavy that the weak breathing of the dog lying on the examination table could be heard. Max, a German shepherd who had spent his life saving others, was now powerless against his own fate. His body was exhausted. The thick, shiny coat he once had was now faded and rough. His once sharp, determined eyes were now clouded by time. His breathing grew heavier, his chest rising and falling weakly. Death was near, and Max knew it. The syringe was ready. Dr. Larson took a deep breath. His hands were steady, accustomed to moments like this, but his heart still felt heavy. He had helped many animals pass peacefully, but this wasn't just any dog. Max was a warrior, a hero, a friend. It was time to say goodbye. But then, just as the needle touched his thin skin, Max moved, slowly, painfully, but with all the strength he had left. He lifted his head, and then, a howl tore through the heavy silence. It wasn't a cry of fear. It wasn't a plea for his life. It was a deep request, a desperate call from the bottom of his soul. Max couldn't leave without seeing his owner one last time. The only problem, Daniel, Max's best friend and lifelong companion, was miles away, lying weak on his deathbed. No one thought they could meet again, but what happened next left the world speechless. Before we continue, please subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications. This story will forever change how you see loyalty. The room was heavy with silence, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of machines and the distant murmur of conversations outside. The overhead fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the small veterinary clinic, their cold illumination doing nothing to soften the heartache in the air. Max lay still on the steel table, his once powerful frame reduced to frailty. His fur, once thick and sleek, was now dull and graying around his muzzle. His deep brown eyes, which had once burned with purpose, were cloudy and unfocused. Breathing was hard for him now, each inhale rattling deep in his chest. His body had given everything it had to give. Dr. Larson stood beside him, gently running a hand over the old German shepherd's head. His touch was careful, reverent even. He had done this before, many times, but it never got easier. Max wasn't just another dog. He was a hero, 14 years of service. A career spent running into danger when others ran away. Max had been a rescue K9, trained to sniff out survivors in collapsed buildings, to find people lost in the wilderness, and to pull the injured to safety. He had saved lives, more than anyone could count. But time was undefeated, and now the body that had once moved with such precision and strength was failing him. The vet sighed, glancing at the small team of assistants who stood in the room, watching quietly. They had seen the reports, and they knew Max's story. Max's body was shutting down, and the pain was increasing. His muscles were too weak to hold him up, and his heart was beginning to fail. Euthanasia had been the humane choice. But what made this situation unbearable wasn't just the passing of a legend. It was the cruel twist of fate that had made it impossible for Max to spend his final moments with the only person who had ever truly mattered to him, Daniel, his handler, his best friend, his partner. Daniel had been Max's world since the day they met. A former firefighter, he had worked alongside Max for nearly a decade, risking his life in disasters and trusting his K9 partner for his own survival. They had been inseparable. Their bond was one forged in fire, in danger, in nights spent digging through rubble to save strangers. But now, Daniel was dying too, a cancer so aggressive that it had left him bedridden in hospice care. He had fought for as long as he could, but the disease had won. His body, once so strong, had withered, just like Max's. The day they had called him to tell him that Max was slipping away, he had begged the doctors to let him go to him. He had begged them to bring Max to him, but his condition was so fragile that even moving from the bed could mean the end for him. So here they were, two warriors, two survivors, both fading, both alone. Daniel had one request: let me be with him when it happens. But it was impossible. Dr. Larson took a deep breath, sadness pressing against his chest. He reached for the syringe, preparing the lethal injection that would take away Max's pain. The old German shepherd lay still, his breathing shallow, his body exhausted. Larson whispered, "It's okay, boy. You can rest now." Then, as the cold tip of the needle brushed against Max's skin, something happened. Max moved. Slowly, with all the strength he had left, he lifted his head. His ears twitched, his muscles tensed. Then, from deep within his chest, he let out a sound so raw, so full of pain and longing, that it sent chills through the room. He howled. It wasn't just a noise. It was a cry, a plea, a call. A desperate, heart-wrenching demand to see his owner. The sound cut through the room like a blade. One of the vet assistants gasped, covering her mouth. The receptionist outside paused mid-step, her eyes wide. Max howled again, his voice weaker this time but just as urgent. It was as if he knew. As if, even from miles away, he could feel Daniel slipping away. As if he understood that his best friend was on the other side of the city, just as close to death as he was. Dr. Larson's hand trembled. He had been ready to press the plunger, to let Max drift peacefully into the dark, but now he hesitated. Then the door to the room burst open. A nurse from the front desk stood there, her face pale, her phone clutched tightly in her shaking hand. "You need to stop," she gasped. "Daniel, he's coming," Dr. Larson frowned. "That's not possible. He's in hospice, he's coming," the nurse repeated, pressing the phone to her ear. "They said he's refusing to stay in that bed. They can't stop him." The vet's eyes widened. Max had called for him, and Daniel had heard. The room was frozen in shock. Max, the old German shepherd who had barely moved in days, now lay breathless after his desperate howl. His body trembled, his breathing shallow, but his eyes burned with something new. Hope. Dr. Larson pulled back, gripping the syringe in his hand. The lethal injection, just moments away from being administered, now felt heavier than ever. He looked at the nurse, still standing in the doorway, her phone clutched tightly. "Daniel is on his way?" he asked, his voice tight with disbelief. The nurse nodded frantically. "His doctor said they tried to stop him. He's too weak, but he won't listen. He's demanding to see Max." Silence. One of the vet assistants, a young woman with teary eyes, whispered, "How? He can't even stand." No one had an answer. Daniel's cancer had drained every ounce of strength from him. The last time Dr. Larson had spoken to his hospice nurse, they had said he could barely lift his head. There was no way he could make the trip, and yet, he was coming. Max's howl had reached him. The old dog shifted on the table, his front paw twitching slightly. He had been slipping away, fading into that quiet, painless place where sleep turned to forever. But something had pulled him back, his owner, his best friend, his reason to fight. Dr. Larson exhaled, placing the syringe back onto the tray. "Then we wait." The entire room exhaled with him. But waiting might not be enough. Daniel's hospice room was a blur of chaos. Nurses pleaded with him, trying to ease him back into bed, but he fought them off with what little energy he had left. His body was wasted, weak, and barely functioning, but none of that mattered. Max needed him. He pushed himself into the wheelchair, his frail hands gripping the arms with every ounce of strength he had left. His vision swam, black spots dancing in his periphery, but he forced himself to breathe through the pain. "I have to go," he rasped. His doctor, a weary man who had seen too many patients fight battles they couldn't win, crouched beside him. "Daniel, listen to me. Your body, I don't care." Daniel snapped, fire in his voice for the first time in months. "I have to see him." A nurse squeezed his shoulder, her own eyes glossy. "Then let us help you." The next few minutes were a blur. A gurney was wheeled in, an ambulance was called, and within moments Daniel was being rushed down the hallway. His weak heart pounded from exhaustion and something even stronger, desperation. Every bump in the road rattled through his bones, but he didn't complain. The only thing that mattered was making it in time. Back at the clinic, Max's breathing was slowing again. Dr. Larson watched the monitors carefully, his stomach tight with dread. They had paused the euthanasia, but how much longer could Max hold on? His body was failing, shutting down. Even now, the old dog's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. His once bright eyes were beginning to dull again. A cold realization hit the room. Daniel might not make it in time. One of the vet assistants whispered, Should we go through with it?" Dr. Larson hesitated. Would it be kinder to let Max go peacefully now before the pain worsens? Or should they hold on, risking unnecessary suffering, just for the chance of a final goodbye? Then, as if sensing the weight of the decision, Max lifted his head once more. He wasn't done waiting. He wasn't giving up. And neither was Daniel. The ambulance sped through the streets, sirens cutting through the night air. Inside, Daniel's eyes stayed open, his fingers gripping the thin hospital blanket draped over him. His heart pounded erratically, every beat a painful reminder of how little time he had left. The paramedic beside him leaned in. "Almost there. Sir. Just hold on." Daniel clenched his jaw. He would hold on. He just needed Max to do the same. Back at the clinic, the vet tech watching the monitors gasped. His vitals, Dr. Larson's head snapped toward her. What about them? They're stabilizing. For the first time in hours, Max's heartbeat was evening out. His breathing, though still weak, was no longer faltering. The old German shepherd was waiting, holding on for his best friend, and the moment Daniel was minutes away, something deep inside Max seemed to know it. The veterinary clinic was drowning in an unbearable stillness. The only sounds were the hum of machines and the soft, labored breathing of Max, the elderly German shepherd lying motionless on the table. His body was fragile, his fur barely rising and falling with each shallow breath. The monitors flickered, tracking a heartbeat that shouldn't still be there. Dr. Larson checked the time. The ambulance was only minutes away, but he wasn't sure if Max had those minutes left in him. His body was shutting down, yet he was holding on, defying reason, defying nature, as if his very soul refused to leave until he saw Daniel one last time. Max had spent his life saving others. Now he was fighting for himself. The vet's assistant, Emily, whispered, "He's really waiting for him, isn't he?" Dr. Larson nodded, his throat tightening. "Yeah, he is." The ambulance screeched to a halt in front of the clinic, and the paramedics rushed to open the doors. Inside, Daniel's frail body trembled with exhaustion, but his hands clenched the rails of the gurney. He was still conscious, his eyes, though sunken and rimmed with shadows of pain, wide with determination. The moment the door swung open, he gasped, "Where's Max?" A paramedic moved fast. "Let's get him inside now." The nurses barely had time to adjust the gurney before Daniel tried pushing himself up. His body wasn't cooperating. He was weak and fragile, but sheer willpower drove him forward. The second they rolled him through the clinic doors, the air changed. Everyone in the waiting area turned. The receptionist covered her mouth. Emily, standing near the exam room, stepped back, her eyes wet with disbelief. Dr. Larson burst through the doors as the paramedics wheeled Daniel closer. "He's still here," the vet said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's waiting for you." Daniel choked back a sob. Inside the exam room, Max lay still. But the moment Daniel's scent filled the air, his body shuddered, a deep inhale, a twitch of his paw, a flicker in his half-closed eyes. Then, a slow, painful attempt to lift his head. Dr. Larson rushed to his side. "Max, easy, boy. He's here. He's here." The old dog tried again, his muscles straining, his ears twitching weakly. He knew Daniel was here. A nurse adjusted the gurney so Daniel could be rolled closer to the table. His breathing was erratic, every movement a struggle, but he didn't stop. He reached out, his trembling fingers brushing against Max's fur. "Hey, buddy," Daniel rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Max's entire body reacted. His tail twitched, for the first time in hours. His chest rose slightly deeper, his breathing shifting. The dying K9 recognized him. Daniel sucked in a breath, his vision blurring. His best friend was still there. "You waited for me," he whispered, his hand pressing gently against Max's side. Max let out a weak, broken whimper. The room was silent, but the energy was deafening. No one dared to speak. No one dared to interrupt the moment between a man and his dog. Dr. Larson felt something deep in his chest tighten. He had witnessed countless goodbyes between owners and their pets, but nothing like this. This wasn't just a dog saying goodbye to his owner. This was a warrior waiting for his partner. Daniel's breathing hitched. He squeezed his eyes shut, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had used every ounce of strength to make it here, but it was worth it. He wasn't going to let Max die alone. "You did good, buddy," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. "You did so good." Max's body relaxed slightly under his touch, the tension fading. The fight he had been holding on to so tightly, the one keeping him here, was beginning to ease. But he still wasn't ready to go. Daniel swallowed, stroking the soft, graying fur around Max's ears. He had been afraid of this moment for weeks, knowing it was coming, dreading it. But now it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like something more, a promise kept, a bond unbroken. Daniel inhaled sharply, blinking away tears that refused to fall. His lips trembled as he leaned in closer, his forehead almost touching Max's. "You don't have to fight anymore," he murmured, "I'm here. You can rest now." Max let out a deep, shuddering exhale. His heartbeat slowed, and his breathing softened. But even as his body weakened, his eyes remained locked on Daniel's. He wasn't afraid. He had waited, and now he was ready. The room stood still. Max's shallow breaths filled the quiet space, each one slower than the last. His frail body, once strong enough to pull survivors from the rubble and brave raging fires, now rested against Daniel's trembling hand. He had held on long enough to see his partner one last time. Daniel's fingers barely had the strength to grip Max's fur, but he refused to let go. His heart pounded wildly against his fragile chest, a painful reminder that time was slipping away for both of them. Dr. Larson stood by, his usual professional demeanor faltering. He had witnessed many goodbyes between pets and their owners, but this was different. This was not just a dog saying goodbye to his owner. This was a bond forged through fire, through years of sacrifice and devotion. Daniel swallowed, his throat raw. "You're a good boy, Max," he said, his voice cracking. He forced the words out. "The best boy." Max let out a faint, broken whimper, his eyes locked onto Daniel's. Though the weight of exhaustion hung heavily over him, his gaze stayed steady. Daniel sucked in a breath. "I didn't want you to go alone," he whispered, his fingers tightening against Max's fur. "I promised, remember?" Max blinked slowly as if he did. The old dog's body trembled. His strength was failing, and yet he refused to close his eyes. He was waiting for Daniel to be ready. The machines in the room beeped softly, tracking Max's weak heartbeat. The veterinary staff stood frozen near the door, unable to look away. Emily, the vet assistant, wiped a tear from her cheek. She had grown used to the sadness of this job, but this was different. Max should have been gone already. He had been at the brink, barely breathing, moments away from slipping into peace. But the second Daniel had touched him, he had found the strength to hold on. No one spoke. No one dared to interrupt. This moment belonged to them. Daniel took another shaking breath. His body was weak, too weak. Even now, he felt himself slipping. The cancer had stolen everything from him, his strength, his independence, his future. But it had not stolen this moment. He had fought to be here, and so had Max. But the fight was coming to an end. Daniel exhaled slowly, pressing his forehead gently against Max's. The warmth of the old shepherd's fur sent a wave of memories crashing through him. Long nights at disaster sites. Long drives in the truck. Long walks when they didn't need words to understand each other. They had always faced everything together. And now, they were facing this together too. "You don't have to fight anymore," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll be okay, buddy. You can rest now." Max let out a deep, shaky sigh. His body, once tense with resistance, finally relaxed. His heartbeat slowed. His breathing softened. Then, just as the weight of years seemed to lift from him, he let out one last breath. And he was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily covered her mouth. The receptionist turned away, her shoulders trembling. Dr. Larson closed his eyes, exhaling through his nose. He had seen this before, but it never stopped hurting. This wasn't just another loss. This was the end of something greater, a partnership, a brotherhood, a love deeper than words. Daniel did not sob. He did not break down. He simply stayed there, his forehead still resting against Max's, his fingers tangled in his fur. His shoulders shook with every breath, his body trembling, but he did not let go. "I'm proud of you," he whispered. Max had waited for him, and now he had gone in peace, knowing he was not alone. And for Daniel, that was enough. Dr. Larson took a careful step forward, reaching out. Daniel, the old firefighter, did not move. His breath was uneven, his body weak, but he remained beside Max. Then his hand slipped from the shepherd's fur. His fingers, once full of strength, went limp. His chest shuddered once, twice, then stilled. Dr. Larson's breath caught. "No," Emily gasped. The monitors let out a sharp, prolonged beep, and in the still of that small, dimly lit room, Daniel followed his best friend. The beep of the heart monitor stretched into a flat, unbroken line. The room stood frozen, the weight of the moment sinking in like a crushing wave. Dr. Larson rushed forward, pressing 2 fingers to Daniel's neck. No pulse. His body was still, his face calm as if he had simply drifted off to sleep. But everyone in the room knew this was no ordinary passing. Daniel had fought with every ounce of strength he had left just to get here. And now, with his best friend gone, it was as if his body had finally let go too. His last battle was over. The bond between a man and his dog had defied even death itself. Emily clutched her clipboard to her chest, her breath shallow, eyes wide with disbelief. He just, the receptionist stepped into the doorway, her hands shaking. Dr. Larson's own heart thundered in his chest. He had seen death before. He had watched people grieve their animals and had witnessed the heartbreak of saying goodbye. But this was different. Daniel hadn't just died. He had followed Max, the paramedics in the hallway, still catching their breath from the rush of getting Daniel inside, heard the prolonged beeping and stormed into the room. "Move," one of them ordered, pushing forward and immediately checking Daniel's vitals. "He's unresponsive." Starting compressions, but Dr. Larson stopped him. The vet shook his head, his face unreadable. "Don't." The paramedic froze, frowning. "What do you mean, don't?" Larson's voice was thick. "Look at him." The paramedics did. Daniel's frail hands still rested against Max's fur. His face was peaceful. His breathing hadn't been panicked before it stopped. He hadn't suffered. He had simply let go. One of the nurses in the hallway, covering her mouth with both hands, whispered, "Oh my God." A heavy, suffocating silence followed. Then, one by one, the staff understood. Max had been waiting for Daniel. Daniel had been holding on for Max. And the moment they were together again, they both knew it was time. The clinic's clock ticked away the seconds, the weight of reality settling on everyone's shoulders. Dr. Larson finally broke the silence. He took a deep, steadying breath, then walked over to Daniel's gurney. Carefully, he reached down and lifted Daniel's hand, placing it over Max's lifeless body, a gesture of honor, a moment of respect. "They belong together," he murmured. No one disagreed. Outside, the storm that had been threatening the horizon all evening finally broke. Rain pattered against the windows in a soft and steady rhythm, as if the heavens themselves were weeping. But inside that small, quiet clinic, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like something far greater, a bond that had never broken, a goodbye that was never really a goodbye, because in the end, they left the same way they had lived, together. The news spread faster than anyone expected. It started with the clinic staff, too shaken to keep it to themselves. A man and his dog, both at the edge of death, had waited for each other and left this world together. A firefighter and his K-9 partner, inseparable in life, now bound in eternity. The story made its way from the veterinary office to the hospice staff, then to Daniel's old fire station. Within hours, it reached news outlets, social media feeds, and the hearts of millions. People who had never met Daniel, who had never known Max, felt the weight of their story deep in their bones. Loyalty like that, it wasn't just rare, it was once in a lifetime. A week later, the firehouse Daniel had served at for most of his life held a memorial. The turnout was overwhelming: firefighters, paramedics, K-9 handlers, veterans. Hundreds of people stood in a ring to honor a man and his dog. The station's flag flew at half-mast, and at the very front, two framed photos stood side by side, one of Daniel, strong and smiling, wearing his turnout gear, and one of Max, his ears perked up, his K-9 badge gleaming on his collar. The city's mayor stepped forward to speak, his voice breaking as he read the words written on a plaque dedicated to them both. "A hero never walks alone, and some bonds, even in death, will never break." At the back of the crowd, standing beneath an umbrella, Dr. Larson watched in silence. He hadn't been able to shake the image of that night, Max holding on for Daniel, Daniel holding on for Max, and then peace. He had seen death before, but he had never seen something like that. It hadn't been a tragedy. It had been something deeper, something he couldn't explain, something that still sent shivers down his spine. Emily, standing beside him, wiped her eyes. "I keep thinking about it," she whispered. "About how he just let go." Dr. Larson nodded slowly. "Yeah," he murmured, because he wasn't afraid anymore. As the ceremony ended, the crowd began to clear, but one firefighter remained behind. He walked up to the plaque, his boots heavy against the wet pavement. Then he knelt down. A German shepherd, younger but strikingly similar to Max, sat beside him. The dog's ears twitched as he gazed up at the photo of the old K-9 hero. Then, quietly, he let out a single mournful whine. The firefighter reached down, stroking the young shepherd's fur. "He had a good life," he whispered. "And now it's time for us to do the same." The young dog lowered his head in quiet understanding. Together, they walked away toward whatever came next. The world moved on, but the story of Max and Daniel never faded. Their names became more than just memories. They became a symbol. Firefighters whispered their stories to new recruits. K-9 handlers told it to their partners, reminding them of the unbreakable bond between a dog and its handler. At the firehouse, a bronze statue was placed at the entrance, a firefighter kneeling beside his loyal German shepherd, forever together. People still visited, running their hands over the plaque engraved with their names. Some left flowers, some left dog tags, and some just stood in silence, feeling the weight of what true loyalty meant. And in homes across the country, people hug their dogs a little tighter because some bonds, even after death, never break. The story of Max and Daniel is more than just a tale of a man and his loyal dog, it is a powerful reminder of loyalty, sacrifice, and an unbreakable bond that even death could not break. Max waited, Daniel came, and together, they left this world side by side. But their story does not end there. It teaches us that true loyalty never fades, that love means giving everything even when we have nothing left, and that some connections are so strong they transcend life itself. We often take time for granted, believing we will always have another day to say, "I love you," or to be there for the ones who matter most. But as this story reminds us, time is never promised. Cherish those you love, keep your promises, and stand by the people who need you, because in the end, the legacy we leave behind is not measured by wealth or achievements, but by the love and loyalty we gave. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes in the power of true connection, because some stories deserve to be remembered forever. 3 months after Max and Daniel passed away, a young firefighter named Jake Carter stood in front of the new bronze statue outside the fire station. The statue depicted a firefighter kneeling beside a German shepherd, his hand resting on the dog's back, a symbol of loyalty and friendship that could never be broken. As the wind whispered through the trees, Jake lowered his head, his thoughts heavy. He had been given a great responsibility, to train and handle Rex, a young K9 chosen to follow in Max's footsteps. From the moment Jake met Rex, he sensed something different. The dog, though young and eager, carried a certain presence, an understanding beyond his years. Every time they passed the fire station's memorial, Rex would pause in front of the glass case displaying Daniel and Max's medals, as if he knew their story. And every night, he would sit by the door, ears perked up, waiting for someone who would never return. But the strangest thing of all was how Rex would stand before the bronze statue of Max, gazing up in silence, as if he was listening. One night, during a rescue mission in a burning apartment building, something inexplicable happened. As Jake and Rex searched for survivors, Rex suddenly froze, staring into the smoke-filled corridor. Then, out of the darkness, a deep bark echoed, not from Rex, but from somewhere else. Through the haze, Jake swore he saw a shadowy figure, a large German shepherd standing beside Rex. It was Max. The figure turned as if giving a signal, and at that moment, Rex sprang into action, leading Jake to a trapped woman and child just seconds before the ceiling collapsed. The next day, standing before the statue, Jake knelt beside Rex, running a hand through the dog's fur. "You think that was Max, don't you?" Rex didn't bark, just looked up at the statue, his eyes gleaming with quiet understanding. Jake exhaled and smiled. "We have a long road ahead, buddy, but I think we have someone guiding us." The wind blew gently through the fire station, and in that moment, Jake no longer doubted himself. He knew that Max and Daniel's legacy had not disappeared, it was living on, through those willing to carry it forward. And now, that journey belonged to Jake and Rex. Do you believe in connections that can't be explained? Do you believe that those who leave us are still watching over us, guiding us in their own way? If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes in the power of loyalty, sacrifice, and bonds that never fade. If this story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story. Share this video with someone who understands the true meaning of loyalty, bravery, and love, because some stories aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be remembered forever.